So you should be now ready to start creating Bitcoin raw transactions. So this allows you to send money but to craft the transactions in precisely the way you want. The first section focuses on a simple one input and one output transaction. This sort of transaction is uncommon and not that useful because it's going to be rare that you'll want to send all of your money to one person or one address, unless of course you're moving your money from say one wallet to another. So in this video, it's going to be more of a stepping stone into sending money with a raw transaction. So the first thing we need to do is understand the Bitcoin transaction and what it consists of. So at its core, a Bitcoin transaction is all about UTXOs, or unspent transaction outputs. And so what is a UTXO? When you receive cash in a Bitcoin wallet, it appears as an individual transaction, and each of these transactions are referred to as unspent transaction outputs. So it doesn't matter how many of these payments you receive, they're all treated as individual transactions, regardless of whether they're sent to the same address or sent to multiple addresses, and they remain distinct and unique inside of your wallet as a UTXO. And when you create outgoing transactions, what you do is you gather one or more UTXOs, and these UTXOs represent a piece of the money that exists within your wallet, and these are used as inputs in your new transactions. So together, the summation of your UTXOs must equal what you want to spend or more. You then generate one or more outputs which give the money represented by the inputs to one or more people. And then this creates what are known as UTXOs for the recipient of the funds you sent. And then these funds can be used to make new transactions in the future. So this is probably best illustrated with a diagram. So if we head over to the browser and have a look at this diagram. So what this diagram is showing is that we have 100,000 Satoshis that have been sent to this address in our first transaction 0, and that was the input, and the outputs, output 0 and output 1, are UTXOs which are being used as inputs for transaction 1 and transaction 2. So output 0 is a UTXO where the input or the amount of Bitcoin we want to send is 40k in Satoshis, and output 1 is a UTXO where we want to send 50k in Satoshis in transaction 2. So what happens now is transaction 1 now has an output 0, which will act as the input for a new transaction, transaction 3. And now in transaction 3, we have an output 0, which is an unspent transaction that can be used further down the line. Similarly, if we follow the trail here, output 1 is a UTXO worth 50k in Satoshis, and that's the input for this transaction. And so this transaction has 50k, 50,000 Satoshis, and the UTXOs for this transaction, output 0 and 1, output 0 is sends 20k in transaction 4, which acts as the input for this transaction, and output 1 sends 20k, which acts as the input for this transaction, and so on and so forth. And so at its core, it's essentially the outputs that are at the essence of Bitcoin transactions, known as unspent transaction outputs, and this is what's known as triple entry bookkeeping, or transaction to transaction payments as used by Bitcoin. So if we head back over to our terminal, what we can do now is have a look at the UTXOs that we have available to send in a transaction. So this can be done from the Bitcoin CLI using the list unspent command. So if we type Bitcoin CLI list unspent, list unspent. We have a list of all of the UTXOs available for spending. So I've got quite a few because I've been requesting quite a lot of Bitcoin from a few of the test nets. So let's try and find one with a decent amount of Bitcoin as well as a good number of confirmations. Because we're on a test net, confirmations don't matter as much, but we will find one with a half decent amount of confirmations. Maybe not this one because it only has 9. So maybe we can go with maybe this one. So 0.01 Bitcoin and 433 confirmations. So we'll go with this one. So what we can do is copy the transaction ID and store it in a variable. So let's Command K and let's store the transaction ID in a variable. So we just type in, let's store it as a UTXO underscore ID and set it equal to that transaction ID, UTXO underscore, or maybe you can call it transaction ID instead, TXID, and save that. And we also want to know what output that transaction was part of. So if we just do list unspent again and do a Command F for that transaction, which is here, and it's the first one or the 0th element in the v out array that's part of that transaction. So we can also store that in a variable as well. So if we do UTXO underscore v out, or UTXO basically equals the first one is what we want to use for that transaction, and save that as well. So it's also important to note that we have to take into account transaction fees as well. So for this transaction, in this transaction we have 0.01 BTC. So let's just go back and have a look at it again. And so transaction fees are implicitly included. So in order to ensure that we get this transaction mined and into a block, we would need to set an amount that we want to send slightly lower than the total amount in this transaction in order to accommodate for the transaction fee. In other words, the transaction fee is the total amount in this UTXO minus the amount you want to send. So we'll probably send, maybe, what do we have, 0.1, so we'll probably send 0.095 and leave 0.005 as enough for our transaction fee. Okay, so we can now go ahead and write a raw transaction with just one output. And as noted earlier, this isn't like a very realistic case because it's more than likely that you want to send, as we saw in the diagram, a number of outputs to different addresses, or unless you're sending all of the money to yourself, which is potentially it could happen, but it's quite unlikely. And so it's also important to note that like sending raw transactions is probably the easiest way to lose all of your money, because you need to know how much you want to send, how much is available in your UTXO, what transaction fee how much you want to spend on transaction fees, and the address you want to send it to as well. So there's quite a lot of things you need to think about when you're conducting raw transactions. So the last thing we want to store in a variable is the recipient, or where we want to send the money to. And so because we don't really have any one to send money to on a testnet, we can just send money back to one of the testnet faucets. So if you head over to the browser again, and you can send the Bitcoin to a testnet of your choosing, but I'll just use this one because I've been using it in a few of the videos, and copy this Bitcoin address, this public address, and store that in a variable as well. And we'll call this one recipient, and set that equal to the testnet faucet address. Cool. And just for clarity, we'll just echo out all of our variables to make sure we've got the right values. So we have the UTXO underscore transaction, UTXO transaction ID. We have the UTXO output. So if we do UTXO, if I can spell, the first one, and then we've also got the address we want to send it to as the recipient. Cool. So we have all of the three components, or the three variables that will allow us to make raw transactions. So the way we create raw transactions through the Bitcoin CLI at least is by calling the create raw transaction method. So if we run just the help command to give us a bit more information about what that does. So it's create raw transaction, and so create raw transaction is create a transaction spending a given inputs and creates new outputs, and it returns a hex encoded raw transaction here. And what it does, it takes a JSON array. JSON stands for JavaScript object notation, and it's basically a data structure, and it takes an array of JSON objects, where the JSON object has a string with the transaction ID, the output number associated with that transaction ID, and a sequence number, which we won't worry about too much for now. And it also takes as outputs similarly a JSON array with outputs with key value pairs, which is the address we want to send to and how much we want to send. So to make life a bit easier, I hopped over to a text editor to write out this JSON command. And what it looks like is, so to open a JSON array, you do 3 ticks. An array is represented by open and closing of square brackets, and an object is opening and closing of curly brackets. And so what it would be is the transaction ID, and the transaction would be set to the transaction ID that you set in your variable, and the vout or the vout would be what you set in your variable for vout. And similarly, the recipient would be the address you saved and the amount of Bitcoin you want to send. So I've made the command already here in the text editor because it was just a bit easier to write. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this one, and it's got the recipient as well as how much I want to send. So I'll copy this over into my terminal, make this slightly bigger, copy this over. So it should return us the hex encoded raw transaction ID, raw transaction hex. So it's a hex encoded transaction. And yeah, so we can, if we press enter and if we echo the raw transaction hex, should get back, if I do $. So here's our hex encoded transaction ID, or just, in fact, no, this is just a hex encoded raw transaction. And so if we want to see it in a bit more visually understandable way, we can use another method as part of the Bitcoin CLI called decode raw transaction. And so what decode raw transaction will do is basically show us all the information about that transaction. So if we type Bitcoin CLI decode raw transaction and pass it our raw transaction hex, what we see here is the raw transaction that we just created. So we have a transaction ID, we have the inputs for that transaction, which is, this is the transaction ID that we took from the original when we listed our unspent UTXOs. So this is the ID for that transaction, as well as which UTXO we want to use in this transaction from the list we received earlier. And here is the output for this transaction, which is saying that we've sent 0.095 Bitcoin, and the address, which is the address of the faucet. So you should just double check that all of these values match up with what you set in your variables, just to make sure you've sending the right amount to the right address and using the right UTXOs. And so now that we created a raw transaction, what we need to do is sign the raw transaction with our public key, or no, well, so the public key of the recipient actually locks the transaction, but we're going to sign the raw transaction with our wallet. So if I can't remember the command for signing a raw transaction, so what I'll do is I'll just head over to the BC help option and see what the commands we have available. So we have, here, so we have sign raw transaction with wallet, and it takes a hex string or a hex encoded string, which we have already stored in a variable called raw tx hex. So what we can do is sign our transaction with wallet. So if we copy this method, do a command K and run the Bitcoin CLI again, and we'll call sign raw transaction with wallet, and we want to take the raw transaction that we created previously. Cool. And so what it returns is the hex encoded string of our signed raw transaction now, and we want to try and capture that in a variable as well. In later videos, we're going to be using a library called JQ, which makes parsing JSON objects a lot easier. So instead of having to essentially copy and paste this string into a variable, we can automatically pull it out and put it into a variable. But just for sake of simplicity and consistency, we'll assign it to a variable by hand. That's not what we want, so we want the actual hex encoded string, and close that and press enter. So now we have our signed transaction. And then the last thing we want to do is actually send the transaction. So now that we've got our transaction ready to go, it doesn't count until we actually send it and put it out into the network. And we can do this with the send raw transaction command. So the send raw transaction command will take a signed transaction and then just return you a transaction ID. So let's do that now. Bitcoin CLI send raw transaction. And then we want to pass it our signed transaction. And this returns us back a transaction ID. And now if we have a look at our unspent transaction or our UTXOs, what we'll find is that it will no longer list the initial UTXO we used for this transaction. So what I mean by that is we have a variable called UTXO underscore transaction ID, if I spell it right. And if we copy this value and now do Bitcoin CLI list unspent and try and find that value, it no longer exists and we can't find it anymore. So it's been spent essentially. So we know that worked. If we head to the list, if we use the list transactions command, we can see whether that transaction has been confirmed and sent. So if we do Bitcoin CLI list transactions, I didn't actually copy the ID from the signed transaction, so just to make sure, I'm gonna head over to the faucet and actually just grab the address just to make sure it's the right one. Okay, cool. So now we have a list of transactions, and this is the address that we sent to, and now it has a category of send, and you can see that the transaction ID and the recipient address match, and it also shows, not only does it show you the amount that is being sent here, but it also shows you the transaction fee. We're yet to have any confirmations just yet, but it's more than likely that will increase in the next 7 to 10 minutes. So that's it. So now you're a few Bitcoin or Satoshis, a few Bitcoin lighter. That's basically how you send a raw transaction. So when money comes into your Bitcoin wallet, it remains a distinct amount called a UTXO. And when you create a raw transaction, you send that money out basically using one or more UTXOs to fund it. You then create a raw transaction, you sign it, and you send it onto the Bitcoin network. However, this is just some of like the foundational ways to send raw transactions. In the next video, we'll be looking at ways we can send raw transactions with multiple outputs to actually send on the Bitcoin network. So I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions or queries, feel free to leave them below, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.